The millionaire's son couldn't walk until the new maid changed everything. The Italian leather briefcase slipped from Alejandro Moreno's hand and struck the marble floor with a dry, echoing crack that rang through the vast entrance hall of the mansion. But Alejandro did not hear it. All of the powerful man's attention was locked on the back garden, where the morning sunlight streamed through the floor-to-ceiling glass windows. A sight his mind refused to accept. His son, Lucas, was standing. Not seated in a wheelchair, not suspended in physical therapy harnesses, not supported by metal frames bracing his fragile legs. The 3-year-old boy, the child whom the finest doctors in Europe and America had declared would never stand again, was standing alone on the grass. His tiny orthopedic shoes sank gently into the lawn. His legs trembled, as fragile as young branches in the wind. His little body swayed, unsteady. Yet he was standing. Alejandro felt his lungs stop working. The air seemed crushed inside his chest. His heart raced wildly, from fear and from a feeling that had been buried for 2 long years. Hope. About 2 meters away, a young woman was kneeling on the grass. She wore a simple blue maid's uniform, a neatly tied white apron, and strikingly out of place were the bright yellow rubber gloves on her hands, a color completely foreign to the refined garden of the elite. It was Elena, the new housemaid who had been working at the Moreno estate for less than 3 weeks. Elena did not look at Lucas with pity, like so many adults did. She looked at him with a radiant smile, her eyes shining as if the child before her were not sick, but a champion preparing to win. She gently clapped her yellow-gloved hands together in a soft, steady rhythm. "Come on, my little prince," Elena said. Her voice carried through the thick glass, softened by the distance, but still full of life. "You can do it. You are very strong." Lucas giggled, a clear, crystalline laugh, a sound Alejandro had not heard since the accident stole his son's legs and his smile. The boy's eyes were fixed on the moving yellow gloves like twin lighthouses guiding his way. Lucas lifted 1 foot, then the other. 1 step, 2 steps, 3 steps. Alejandro felt dizzy. The world seemed to slow. He saw the beads of sweat on his son's forehead, the strain tightening in those tiny legs, the fierce determination burning in those young dark eyes. Then the thing Alejandro feared most happened. On the 4th step, Lucas wobbled. His center of gravity shifted to the right. His small body tilted dangerously. "No!" Alejandro shouted, finally breaking free from his paralysis. But Elena was faster than his fear. She lunged forward on instinct. Her yellow-gloved hands shot out, catching Lucas mid-air before his body could hit the ground. She pulled him tightly into her arms and deliberately rolled onto the grass, using her own body to absorb the entire impact. Lucas did not cry. Instead, he burst into joyful laughter, wrapping his arms around Elena's neck with a strength that would have surprised any adult. Alejandro Moreno ran into the garden so fast that he did not even realize he had done it. The sliding glass doors tore open with a sharp screech, but the garden remained suspended in the fragile moment that had just occurred. Elena was sitting on the grass, her back slightly curved, her arms still wrapped tightly around Lucas against her chest like an instinctive shield. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" Alejandro's voice rang out, hoarse and cutting. It was not only anger, it was the primal fear of a father. He rushed forward and yanked Lucas from Elena's arms in a movement so abrupt it bordered on rough. His hands trembled as he checked every arm, every leg of his son, as if 1 second too late would be enough for the child to shatter before his eyes. "Do you know what my son is suffering from?" Alejandro roared. "His spine is so fragile that even 1 fall could—" "Sir, please calm down," Elena said, springing to her feet. She brushed grass from her apron, but her eyes did not retreat. Lucas did not fall. "But he could have," Alejandro cut in. You have no right to gamble with my son's life. I made it very clear. He is not to leave his wheelchair." Lucas began to stir in his father's arms, not in pain, not in fear. The small boy arched toward Elena, his tiny hands reaching out as if searching for something familiar. "Nana?" The sound froze Alejandro in place. It was not a cry. It was a word, a broken, unfinished word, but unmistakably real. Lucas had spoken. Alejandro bent down toward his son. For 2 years, Lucas's language development had nearly stood still. The accident had taken too much, his legs, his peaceful sleep, and even the innocent voice of a child. "Lucas, what did you say?" Alejandro's voice trembled. The boy frowned in concentration. His small hand clutched his father's lapel. Then Lucas slowly turned and pointed his tiny finger at Elena. "I walk?" Each syllable came out with effort, as if pushing through an invisible wall. "I walk already." Time seemed to freeze. Alejandro felt an invisible force strike straight into his chest. So hard he had to draw a deep breath to remain standing. The man who had faced $100 million deals, who had made decisions that determined whether thousands would lose or gain their jobs, now could not even trust his own ears. Elena stepped forward, her voice softer but steady. "You see," she said, "he is not disabled. He is just a child who has been taught that he cannot." Alejandro snapped his gaze to her. In his eyes, a violent battle raged between logic built from medical reports, scientific warnings, and the image of Lucas wobbling across the grass just minutes before. "You are not a doctor," Alejandro said, his voice lower now, no longer as sharp as before. "You do not understand the risks." Elena nodded. "I am not a doctor. I am only someone who sees a child who is alive, who still feels, who still wants to move forward." She looked at Lucas, her gaze softening. "Nerves need commands to wake up, sir, and fear is a very poor master." Alejandro tightened his hold around Lucas. He looked down at the small leg still trembling from the effort moments earlier. Inside him, a strange sensation began to rise. Not quite belief, but no longer absolute denial either. It was the first crack in the fortress Alejandro Moreno had built around his heart over the past 2 years. That afternoon, the back garden of the Moreno estate returned to its usual quiet. But inside the grand hall, the atmosphere was entirely different. Alejandro sat in the living room with Lucas in his arms, the boy's small legs resting loosely on the expensive Persian rug. The child had fallen asleep after the intense exhaustion of the morning, yet traces of effort still lingered on his face. Alejandro gently stroked his son's hair, his gaze distant. He was trying to convince himself that what he had witnessed was only a fortunate moment, an unconscious reflex, a rare positive accident, and not a true miracle. Just then, the sound of heels echoed. Click, 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 sharp, decisive, and so familiar that Alejandro did not need to look up to know who it was. Veronica Moreno, his sister-in-law. The woman wore a fitted, cream-colored designer dress, its value enough to pay Elena's wages for many years. Veronica's hair was flawlessly styled, her nails painted a deep red, the color of power and control. "You're home late," Veronica said, her voice sweet as honey, while her eyes immediately locked onto Lucas. What was all the commotion this morning? The entire staff was buzzing. Alejandro exhaled softly. "Nothing serious." Veronica raised a brow and stepped closer. She bent slightly to inspect Lucas as if evaluating a fragile possession. "He stood up?" she asked, her voice lowered, laced with carefully rehearsed astonishment. Alejandro did not answer. His silence was answer enough. Veronica straightened, the corners of her lips lifting faintly. "Alejandro, I know you're desperate. I am too. but you cannot allow that desperation to make you lose your judgment. She flicked a glance toward the corridor, where Elena had just passed by, carrying wet towels into the nursery. "Who is she?" Veronica asked, as though noticing her for the first time. "The new maid," Alejandro replied. "Her name is Elena." Veronica let out a soft laugh, one that never reached her eyes. "A maid? You're allowing an uneducated girl with no medical training to handle your son?" "She only plays with him." "Plays?" Veronica repeated pointedly. "Alejandro, people like her never just play. They always have an agenda, especially when the subject is the son of a man who owns half the city's real estate market." Alejandro frowned. "What are you implying?" Veronica stepped closer, lowering her voice as if sharing a frightening secret. "I only want you to be careful. People from low backgrounds learn to survive by taking shortcuts. A small accident, a simple slip, then lawsuits, compensation, and your reputation will be dragged through the mud." Alejandro looked down at Lucas. His brow tightened. Veronica's words struck his deepest fear: losing control. Suddenly, Lucas stirred, whimpered softly, then began to cry. "Nana!" The call rang out, clear and urgent. Before Alejandro could react, Elena appeared in the doorway, as if she had been nearby waiting for that very sound. She knelt beside the sofa, her eyes filled with concern. "What is it, my little prince?" Elena whispered. Lucas immediately reached for her. Veronica watched the scene, her eyes darkening for a split second. Something toxic flashed, then vanished behind her perfect smile. "You see?" Veronica turned to Alejandro. "He's already dependent on her. Children are so easy to manipulate. Candy, games, a little fake attention, and they believe it's love." Elena rose to her feet. For the first time, she did not avoid Veronica's gaze. "Madam," Elena said clearly, her voice steady, "I am not manipulating Lucas. I am simply listening to him." Veronica laughed louder, her voice echoing across the living room. Listening? What could a poor maid possibly understand about a special child like Lucas? The air froze. Alejandro stood between the two women. On one side, logic, wealth, status, and fear. On the other, a poor girl with yellow gloves and unwavering eyes, the woman who had just witnessed his son do the impossible. Lucas cried harder, stretching his arms toward Elena. Alejandro felt as though his head were about to explode, and he did not yet know that from the very moment Veronica stepped into this house with her honeyed whispers, a silent war had officially begun. A war whose target was not only power, but the fate of a child. That evening, the Moreno mansion was brightly lit as usual, but the atmosphere felt far heavier. Alejandro sat in his study, a thick stack of medical files labeled Lucas Moreno spread out before him. The cold words, the dry scientific terminology, had been the only things keeping him standing for the past 2 years. They gave him something precious: certainty. What had happened in the garden that morning was too emotional, too dangerous. A knock sounded at the door. "Come in," Alejandro said without looking up. Dr. Salazar entered, a middle-aged man with thin-framed glasses, a tired face but sharp eyes. He had been Lucas's primary physician since the very first day. "I've reviewed all the imaging and test results again," Dr. Salazar said, placing a folder on the desk. "I also personally examined Lucas once more." Alejandro looked up. "And?" Dr. Salazar took a deep breath, as though he himself were trying to believe what he was about to say. "There is no new damage to the spine," he said slowly. "No tearing, no inflammation, no compression." Alejandro held his breath. On the contrary, Dr. Salazar continued, turning another page. "The muscle mass in Lucas's thighs and calves has increased slightly, which is highly unusual for his condition. His neural reflexes have also improved by about 30 to 40% compared to the last evaluation. Alejandro felt his heart pound. "You mean this morning didn't cause harm?" Dr. Salazar met his gaze. "I mean, it appears to have brought benefits." Silence stretched. "But," Dr. Salazar added gravely, "I do not encourage activities without medical supervision. There are risks involved." Alejandro nodded. That was exactly what he needed to hear, a warning to keep everything under control. "Whatever you're doing," Dr. Salazar concluded, pointing at the final note in the report, "don't stop. This is the first real progress I've seen." When the doctor left, Alejandro remained seated in silence for a long time. Don't stop. Those 3 words echoed in his mind, colliding with Veronica's warnings, Elena's yellow gloves, and the fear of losing his son that had taken root in his heart. Alejandro stood, intending to find Elena to talk, but as he passed the corridor leading to the servants' quarters, he suddenly heard Veronica's voice. "Listen carefully, Elena." Her voice was low and blade cold. "I don't care what you do with the boy. Walk, crawl, or fly. I couldn't care less." Alejandro stopped, pressing his back against the wall. "If he recovers," Veronica continued, "Alejandro will no longer need me to manage the family trust fund. And that is not good for me." A chill ran down Alejandro's spine. "So," Veronica said, each word dropping heavily, "you will leave this house, voluntarily, or by any other means." A pause. Then Elena's voice answered, trembling slightly, but resolute. "I will not leave," she said, "because Lucas needs me, and Mr. Alejandro is a good man. He is only blinded by pain." Veronica laughed with contempt. "You are far too naive. In this house, the truth does not matter. Whoever controls fear wins." Footsteps moved away. Alejandro stood frozen in the darkness of the corridor. He now had medical proof that his son was improving. But what he had just overheard revealed another truth, a truth about power, ambition, and conspiracy. And he realized that, whether he wanted to or not, he was standing between 2 blades. On one side, science and hope. On the other, family. And the invisible threat tightening around his son's fate. Dinner that evening was served in the grand dining room of the Moreno mansion, a space that was usually cold and formal, where the finely carved oak chairs typically witnessed only heavy, silent meals. But tonight, something was different. Lucas was laughing. The little boy sat in his specialized dining chair, his small hands lightly tapping on the tabletop in rhythm, producing cheerful sounds. On his thin face, for the first time in a very long while, a faint flush of pink had appeared. Elena stood beside him, bending down to cut each piece of chicken into small portions, so patient it felt as though time itself moved more slowly around her. "Just one more bite, my little prince," she whispered. "So your legs can grow strong." Alejandro sat at the head of the table, his eyes never leaving his son. He did not realize he was smiling, a very small, very rare, but genuine smile. To his right, Veronica gently swirled her wine glass. The deep red liquid reflected the crystal chandelier light, glittering like gemstones. Her gaze shifted constantly between Elena, Lucas, and Alejandro, calculating every movement. "It's wonderful to see him eating so well," Veronica said sweetly. "Isn't it time for his vitamins?" Elena nodded. "Yes, ma'am, I have them ready." She reached into her apron pocket and took out a small amber glass bottle, a familiar pharmacy brand, placing it on the table beside Lucas's plate. Alejandro glanced at the bottle, then at his son. Everything looked completely normal. Too normal. Elena turned toward the cabinet to get a glass of water. In that single moment, "Ah!" Veronica exclaimed, deliberately dropping her napkin in an unbelievably clumsy motion. "Oh no, but my earring! The diamond fell out!" Out of gentlemanly reflex, Alejandro immediately bent down under the table to help search. Elena also turned at the sudden cry. In that shared blind moment, Veronica's hand moved, fast, precise, perfect. She slipped an identical bottle from within her dress, switched it with the one on the table, and hid the real bottle into the folds of her silk skirt, as if nothing had happened. "I found it," Veronica said at once, lifting the napkin with a fake look of relief. "It was caught in the lace trim. I'm so clumsy." Alejandro straightened, adjusting his vest. "Be more careful next time." Elena had returned with the glass of water. She saw nothing. She picked up the bottle on the table, the swapped one, tilted it slightly, and dripped a few drops of the clear liquid into the spoon. "Open up, Lucas. Here comes the airplane." Elena smiled, bringing the spoon closer. Lucas obediently opened his mouth. He frowned as he swallowed. "Bitter," Lucas murmured. "Medicine is like that, sweetheart," Elena soothed, gently wiping his lips. "Medicine isn't sweet, but it makes you strong." Dinner continued. 5 minutes passed. 10 minutes. No one noticed anything wrong, until the plastic spoon slipped from Lucas's hand and fell to the floor, producing a soft yet piercing sound in the quiet room. Alejandro looked up. "Lucas?" The boy blinked slowly. His head drooped slightly, then lifted again, as if fighting an unusual wave of drowsiness. "I'm tired," Lucas said, his words dragging together. Then everything happened too fast. Lucas's eyes rolled back. His body stiffened for a brief second, then convulsed violently. The chair shook as his small body collapsed forward, his face plunging straight into the plate. "Lucas!" Elena's scream tore through the room. Alejandro leapt up, knocking over the dining table in his panic, and rushed to pull his son into his arms. Lucas's body was limp, his skin pale, his breathing terrifyingly weak. White foam spilled from the corner of his mouth. "Call an ambulance!" Alejandro shouted, his voice breaking. Veronica froze for a second, then immediately slipped into her role. She covered her mouth, eyes wide with horror. "Oh my God, what's happening?" she cried. Then suddenly spun toward Elena, her voice turning sharp. "It was you! You just gave him something!" Elena stood frozen, her hands shaking violently. No, it wasn't. Those were vitamins," she stammered. "I only gave him the vitamins?" Alejandro could no longer hear anything. In his mind there was only one image left: his son dying in his arms. And as he carried Lucas out of the dining room, Veronica slowly bent down, picked up the empty bottle from the table, slipped it into her pocket, then quietly let another bottle, with a bright red warning label, roll out near Elena's feet. Everything was ready. 3 days passed. 3 days in which the Moreno mansion became a vast mausoleum. Lucas's laughter was gone. Elena's soft singing no longer drifted through the garden. The hurried footsteps with bright yellow gloves had vanished. Only suffocating silence remained. Lucas had survived the crisis. His stomach had been pumped in time, the sedative neutralized, and his tiny heart was still beating. But what returned was not the boy from before. Lucas lay in bed, eyes open but empty. He did not speak, did not smile, did not reach out when Alejandro called his name. He sat motionless in his wheelchair, chin resting on his chest, as if all the life inside him had been drained away. "Lucas, look at Daddy," Alejandro whispered, kneeling in front of his son. "Shall we try walking again, like that day in the garden?" Alejandro took his tiny hands, gently pulled. Lucas jerked his hands back as if burned. "No," he whispered, his voice breaking, then like a blade driven straight into a father's heart. "Nana, gone." Alejandro froze. That night he sent the nurse away and sat alone in his son's room. The whiskey on the table remained untouched, yet his throat burned. He stared at Lucas's legs, the legs that had trembled but had stood. Now they lay still, like two dry branches. The medical report echoed mercilessly in his mind. Abnormal neurological improvement, reflexes enhanced. Then why? Had everything vanished in just 3 days? Alejandro rose and wandered to the kitchen like a sleepwalker. The kitchen was spotless. Too spotless. Veronica had ordered a complete cleaning just hours after the incident, citing hygiene. A sentence suddenly echoed in his mind, like a voice from hell. Check the kitchen trash. Alejandro stopped cold. Today was Wednesday. The garbage truck came on Thursday. He turned and strode out the back door. The hot afternoon wind struck his face, carrying the stench of waste from the large green bins. Alejandro rolled up the sleeves of his expensive vest. Hands that once signed million-dollar contracts now trembled as he lifted the lid. The stench rushed out. "I've lost my mind," he murmured. "You've completely lost it, Alejandro." But he kept going. First bag, leftovers. Second bag, tissues, plastic containers. The third bag was smaller, tightly tied and carefully hidden inside. Alejandro tore it open. Inside was an empty glass bottle. Not the vitamin bottle, a powerful sedative bottle, exactly the kind the doctor had named. Alejandro's heart pounded painfully. He held the bottle up to the sunlight, filtering through the frosted glass. And then he saw it. A faint red smear clearly visible on the label. A fingerprint. Dark red. The color of luxury nail polish. A color Elena had never worn. Alejandro squeezed his eyes shut. Images from that dinner rushed back. Veronica swirling her wine glass. Veronica dropping her napkin. Veronica's carmine red nails glowing beneath the chandelier. Alejandro opened his eyes, gripping the bottle until his knuckles turned white. "What have I done?" he whispered. He looked up toward the second-floor balcony. The door to Veronica's room was slightly ajar. Soft music drifted out, the relaxed laughter of someone who believed she had already won. Something inside Alejandro collapsed completely. Not fear, not hesitation, but the illusion that he truly knew his family. He had handed his son to a monster and thrown the only innocent woman into hell. Alejandro pulled out his phone. His hand trembled, but his voice was terrifyingly cold as he dialed. "Alonzo," he said to his private criminal attorney, "cancel every meeting. Go to the police station immediately." On the other end, Alonzo hesitated. "Alejandro, what's going on?" "I need you to get Elena Ruiz out of there," Alejandro growled. "Today." He ended the call. Then he returned to Lucas's room. The boy still sat motionless. When he saw his father, Lucas looked up with reddened eyes. "Daddy," he whispered. "Daddy wrong." Alejandro dropped to his knees before his son and pulled him tightly into his arms. "Yes," he whispered, tears falling for the first time in years. "Daddy was wrong, and Daddy will fix it." The real war had just begun. That night, Alejandro Moreno did not sleep. He sat in his study, the desk lamp casting light over his hollowed face. His eyes were bloodshot, yet chillingly alert. On the desk lay the empty medicine bottle sealed in a temporary evidence bag. Beside it were Lucas's medical files and a copy of Elena's arrest report. All the pieces were finally in front of him. And for the first time in years, Alejandro understood a terrifying truth. The enemy was not out there. It was inside his own house. The door opened without a sound. Martín Alvarez, head of security for the Moreno Group, stepped in. A former intelligence officer, taciturn but never mistaken. "You called for me," Martín said. Alejandro slid the bottle toward him. "I want you to test this. Fingerprints, residual contents, and I want to know who touched it." Martín glanced at it and immediately understood. "Not through the police?" "Not yet," Alejandro replied. I need the truth before someone has time to erase it. Martín nodded. I'll have it done tonight. Alejandro stood and went to the wall behind his desk. He opened a hidden safe behind a painting and took out a black hard drive. The house security system, he said. Veronica claims the footage from that night malfunctioned and was erased. Martín gave a faint smile. If it's your system, there is no such thing as erased completely. Alejandro looked at him. I want to see that dinner. Every second. 2 a.m, 3 large screens lit up in the security room. The footage was mercilessly sharp. The dining room appeared, Lucas laughing, Elena bending down, Alejandro at the head of the table. Then Veronica entered the frame. Pause, Alejandro said. Martín slowed the footage. Veronica dropped the napkin. Alejandro bent down. Elena turned away. Slower. Martín adjusted the speed. And then, unmistakable, Veronica's hand produced another bottle and swapped it in an instant, the practiced movement of someone who had rehearsed in front of a mirror. Alejandro did not breathe. Another angle, he said. Ceiling camera, hallway camera. Every view recorded the same truth. Veronica had poisoned her own nephew. Alejandro stepped back, his heart hammered, not in shock, but in pure fury. There's more, Martín said grimly. I found this. The screen changed. The servants' corridor. Elena's door slightly open. Timestamp 2 hours before police arrival. Veronica looked around, then entered. 30 seconds later, she came out. Thin smile, cold. She planted the watch, Alejandro murmured. Martín nodded. And there's this, too. The final screen lit up. Lucas's bedroom, the morning after the poisoning. Veronica stood by the bed. Lucas cried weakly. Audio was activated. Be quiet, Veronica's voice cut like a blade. Don't call that woman anymore. She's not coming back. Then the sound of a sharp grip. Lucas screamed in pain. Alejandro did not shout. He stood perfectly still. The most terrifying silence Martín had ever witnessed. Prepare 3 copies, Alejandro finally said. 1 for my lawyer, 1 for the court, 1 for me. Martín hesitated. And Veronica? Alejandro turned. There was no trace of family warmth left in his eyes. Don't touch her, he said. Not yet. Martín understood immediately. You want to catch her in the act. Alejandro nodded. And I want Elena released today. At the same time, at the city detention center, Elena curled on a cold iron bunk. 3 days inside the damp walls had drained her strength. Her hair was disheveled, her eyes sunken. The iron door opened. A man in a suit stepped in, Alonso Vega, the attorney. Elena Ruiz, he said, you're being released. Elena looked up, stunned. What? What do you mean? For lack of evidence, Alonso replied meaningfully. And because someone very powerful has realized he made a terrible mistake. Tears welled in Elena's eyes, but she did not smile. Only one question filled her mind. Is Lucas alive? Outside the detention gate, a black car waited. Alejandro Moreno stood there. No tailored suit, no arrogance, just a man with a weary face and eyes full of remorse. When Elena stepped out, they locked eyes. Alejandro bowed his head, a deep, genuine bow. I'm sorry, he said quietly. I'm sorry I didn't trust you. Elena did not answer immediately. She looked at him for a long moment. Then she asked, her voice trembling, Is Lucas alive? Alejandro nodded. He is, but he's losing hope. Elena closed her eyes. Then we have no time, she said. She's still there. Alejandro opened the car door. This time, he said, his voice low and steel-hard, we end this. Together. The Moreno mansion blazed with light that night, not the warm glow of a home, but the exposing light of an execution ground. Veronica lay stretched across the living room sofa in her cream silk dress, a champagne flute in hand. She gave a soft laugh as a new message appeared on her phone. Elena Ruiz released due to lack of evidence. Too late, Veronica murmured, her lips curving. Far too late. The front door opened, not Alejandro alone, as she had expected. Alejandro entered first. Behind him was Elena, and after them 3 men in black suits, including Martín Alvarez. Veronica sprang to her feet. "What is this?" she demanded, still trying to maintain her composure. "Why is she here?" Alejandro did not answer. He signaled to Martín. The large wall screen lit up. Veronica saw the dining room, the dinner, herself. "What are you doing?" she snapped. "This is an invasion of privacy." "Silence," Alejandro said. The footage slowed, the napkin falling, Alejandro bending down, Veronica's hand switching the bottle, Veronica's face drained of color. "Edited," she blurted. "A cheap trick." Martín changed the angle. Ceiling camera, hallway camera. Undeniable. "No," Veronica screamed. "She framed me. The child was with her all day." Alejandro stepped forward. "You poisoned your own nephew." "For you," Veronica shrieked as her mask shattered. "For everything I did for this family." Alejandro remained unmoved. "For money?" Veronica laughed hysterically. "Yes, for power, because if the boy recovered, you would no longer need me to control the trust fund." Elena trembled at the words, but she did not look away. Martín switched scenes. Servants' corridor, Veronica planting the watch. Lucas's bedroom, Veronica gripping the child's arm. "Stop it!" Veronica screamed, lunging toward the screen. Alejandro blocked her. "You terrified him to the point he wanted to die." Veronica collapsed onto the sofa. "You don't understand," she whispered. "That boy is a burden. He destroys everything." Alejandro bent down, locking eyes with her. "No, you are what destroys." Police sirens wailed in the distance, growing closer. Veronica looked up in panic. "Alejandro, you can't do this to me. I'm family." Alejandro turned away. "Family does not poison children." The doors burst open. Police flooded in. "Veronica Moreno," the inspector read the warrant. "You are under arrest for attempted murder of a minor, falsifying evidence, and child abuse." Veronica screamed and struggled. As she was dragged away, she twisted to glare at Elena, hatred blazing in her eyes. "You think you've won?" she hissed. "You're just hired help." Elena stepped forward, her voice strangely calm. "I am the one who saved Lucas," she said, "and you are not." The doors slammed shut. Silence settled over the mansion like a mourning veil being lifted. Alejandro stood motionless for several seconds, then turned to Elena. "Are you all right?" Elena nodded, her eyes already on the staircase. "Where is Lucas?" "Upstairs." She did not wait. She ran up the stairs, one step at a time. Alejandro followed, more slowly. The door to Lucas's room opened. The boy sat on the bed, clutching a pillow. When he saw Elena, he froze for a second, then his lips trembled. "Nana?" Elena knelt, not touching him yet. "Nana's here, my prince." Lucas burst into sobs and ran into her arms. "I thought Nana wasn't coming back." Elena held him tightly. "Nana is here. No one will hurt you again." Alejandro stood at the doorway, watching. A man who once believed he had lost everything now understood. He had nearly lost what mattered most, his son's trust. "We still have a long road ahead," Elena said once Lucas had calmed. "He is deeply traumatized." Alejandro nodded. "This time, I will not stand aside." Elena looked at him, serious. "And I will not work alone." Alejandro understood. "You will have full authority over Lucas's care." A promise. A real promise. Outside, Veronica was placed into a police car. Inside this house, a new order had just been established. 2 weeks after Veronica's arrest, the Moreno mansion seemed to awaken from a long nightmare. But the bad dreams had not fully gone. Lucas was alive, but he was no longer the little boy eagerly practicing his steps in the garden. He flinched at sudden movements, startled at slamming doors, and woke every night in tears. "Nana, don't go," Lucas whispered in his delirious sleep. Elena slept right beside his bed on a small chair. She did not dare step away, even for a moment. Alejandro stood in the hallway, watching through the slightly open door. He had canceled every meeting and handed temporary control of the corporation to the board. For the first time in his life, he understood that some things could not be delegated. Lucas needed the presence of both of them. 6 months passed, no loud miracles, no celebrated first runs, no sensational headlines about the disabled child who stood up. Only quiet days. Veronica's trial passed quietly, without fanfare. Alejandro did not attend. He only read the sentence sent by his lawyer. 25 years in prison, no early parole, for attempted murder of a minor, falsification of evidence, and child abuse. Elena received the news and simply nodded. She was not happy. She was not hurt, because to her the greatest enemy had never been Veronica, but the fear that had imprisoned Lucas within his own body. One late autumn afternoon, the garden was carpeted with golden leaves. Lucas stood in the middle of the lawn, his arms hanging loosely at his sides. Elena stood a few steps away, her hands raised, just like the very first day. "No running," she said. "Just step." Alejandro held his breath. Lucas looked down at his legs, looked for a long time, then lifted his head. "Nana, watch me." Elena smiled, her eyes wet. "Nana is always watching you." Lucas stepped forward, 1 step, then a second. No applause, no cheering, only the rustle of dry leaves beneath the boy's feet. By the 5th step, Lucas faltered, losing his balance. Alejandro surged forward instinctively, but Elena raised her hand to stop him. "Let him choose," she said. Lucas wobbled, then steadied himself. He burst into laughter, a clear, fearless laugh. "I didn't fall." Elena dropped to her knees, tears streaming freely. "That's right. You were never someone meant to fall." Alejandro turned away, covering his face. For the first time in years, he cried not from despair, but from gratitude. Time moved on. Lucas still needed his wheelchair for long distances. There were still days of exhaustion, pain, and frustration. But he had learned the most important thing. The body may be weak, but the will is not. One evening, after Lucas had fallen asleep, Alejandro and Elena sat in the kitchen. No longer employer and maid, no more contracts. Just 2 adults sharing the responsibility of loving a child. "I used to think," Alejandro said softly, "that a miracle would be Lucas running like other children." Elena smiled. "And I think the miracle was when you were willing to sit on the floor and play with him." Alejandro laughed, a real laugh. "I was wrong about many things," he said, "but if I could choose again, I would still want to meet you." Elena met his gaze, this time without looking away. "So would I."